What does it mean when humanity is cast aside and the innocent are made to pay the price? A question we find ourselves asking in the wake of a shocking event that has sent ripples across the globe. We're talking about the brutal murder of 6 Israeli hostages in Gaza by Hamas, a chilling act that has left the world in a state of disbelief. Among the victims was Israeli-American Hersh Goldberg Poland, his life extinguished in the most unthinkable way. Across the Atlantic, U.S. President and Vice President are voicing their sorrow, their words heavy with the weight of the tragedy. Their call for the elimination of Hamas echoes across international borders, a stark response to an act of senseless violence. Meanwhile, back in Israel, the public's reaction has been one of outrage and despair. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu finds himself in the eye of the storm, facing criticism for his failure to secure a hostage deal. The pain is palpable, the anger is real, and the demand for justice is loud and clear. As the world reels from this horrific act, one country remains conspicuously silent. Where is India's voice in this global outcry, one might ask? As the world reels in shock from the gruesome murder of 6 Israeli hostages by Hamas, India's silence is deafening. One of the world's most populous democracies, known for its stand on global peace and justice, has yet to utter a word on the matter. Why this silence? Could it be a strategic move considering India's historical ties with both Israel and Palestine? Or perhaps it's a reflection of India's internal political climate, which often shapes its response to international events. This silence is puzzling, especially when compared to India's past reactions to similar global tragedies. India has often been a vocal critic of terrorism, and has expressed solidarity with nations facing such atrocities. Remember the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France? India was among the first nations to condemn the act and express support for the French people. But in this case, its silence is mystifying, raising questions about the factors influencing its diplomatic decisions. In the face of such a tragedy, silence speaks volumes. As the world mourns, blame is being placed, but where does it truly belong? In the wake of this tragedy, the finger of blame is being pointed in several directions. At the heart of this blame game is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Critics argue that it was his responsibility to secure a deal with Hamas to ensure the safe return of the hostages. They argue that his inability to do so has resulted in the needless loss of 6 lives. Families of the victims are among those leading the charge against Netanyahu, their sorrow transforming into anger and frustration at what they perceive as a failure of leadership. Yet it's not just the families expressing their discontent. Opposition leader Yair Lapid has accused Netanyahu of mishandling the situation. Lapid argues that the prime minister's approach was flawed and has resulted in an unnecessary escalation of violence. He calls for a different strategy, one that prioritizes dialogue over force. However, as we delve into this blame game, we must not overlook the role of Hamas in this tragedy. They are the ones who abducted and brutally murdered these innocent victims. The international community, led by the United States, is calling for the elimination of Hamas. Their suspected motive for these murders is chilling: to prevent details about other captives from being revealed. This act of brutality has only strengthened the call for their elimination. In the midst of tragedy, the search for accountability is a complex web of politics and power. As we continue to mourn the loss of these lives, we must also strive to understand the political dynamics at play. Only then can we hope to prevent such tragedies in the future. What happens when the dust settles and the world is left to grapple with the aftermath? In the wake of the brutal elimination of 6 Israeli hostages by Hamas, the ripple effects are being felt far beyond the borders of Gaza. This tragedy has sent shockwaves through the international community, stirring a cauldron of complex emotions and sparking a flurry of diplomatic activity. The repercussions on international relations are already apparent. Countries are being forced to reevaluate their stance on the long-standing Israel-Palestine conflict, with the issue of terrorism coming into sharp focus. The global community is grappling with an urgent need to address this violence while navigating the sensitive terrain of political alliances and national interests. Meanwhile, the fate of the remaining 97 hostages hangs in the balance. Their lives have become a fulcrum on which the scales of international diplomacy and human rights teeter precariously. The urgency of securing their release has been underscored by the tragic loss of their fellow captives, turning the spotlight on the role of negotiation in these fraught situations. Back in Israel, the public outcry is palpable. protests have erupted across the country, fueled by a potent mix of grief, anger, and a demand for justice. The citizens are pointing a finger of blame at the government, particularly Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, for failing to secure a hostage deal. The public's clamor for justice is growing louder by the day, echoing through the streets and halls of power. Across the Atlantic, US President Biden and Vice President Harris have expressed their sorrow and condolences. Their words of sympathy and calls for the elimination of Hamas underline the gravity of the situation. Their stance has added another layer of complexity to the international response, highlighting the intricate web of global politics at play. In the wake of such a tragedy, the world is left to question, mourn, and demand justice. But will it be enough? In the midst of this global crisis, we cannot simply stand by and watch. Now more than ever, there is a need for a unified response to this act of terror. We must remember that these are not just numbers or headlines. These are human lives hanging in the balance. As the global community, we must rise above our differences, our conflicting interests. It is time for countries to rally together, to stand against the face of terrorism. We must remember that inaction and silence are complicity. It is vital for us to raise our voices, to demand justice for the victims, to call for the release of the remaining hostages. We must push for diplomatic negotiations, for peaceful resolution. We must remember that every life is precious and irreplaceable. The public outcry in Israel is a stark reminder of this. Their grief, their anger, their demand for justice should be echoed across the globe. The words of US President Biden and Vice President Harris should not just be words of sympathy, but a call to action. The international community must join hands to ensure that such a tragedy is not repeated. We must work together to dismantle the networks of terrorism, to create a world where every person can live without fear. In this moment of crisis, let us remember our shared humanity. Let us remember that we are stronger together. Let us remember that we have the power to change the world. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, and until next time.